note too, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but I want to make it clear at this point. Because these ideas that you're about to hear come from Christian monasticism, I'm going to use some Christian language to explain them. But wherever I possibly can, I'm also going to talk about application in a secular context. My point in writing the book was not to say you have to be a Christian in order to practice this, but rather here's what the wisdom of this wonderful tradition looks like, and maybe we can use it as we move forward. So this effort toward inner transformation happens on 3 levels. First one is what I would call the spiritual dimension or the inner dimension. The practices on this level are designed to allow the deepest part of ourselves, our heart, our soul, whatever you want to call it, to encounter wisdom outside ourselves, day after day after day. You're going to hear the phrase outside ourselves a lot, because that's really the goal of many of these practices, is to get us outside ourselves. The more we contact this wisdom outside ourselves, the more we begin to reflect it. The more we begin to reflect it, the more we begin to reflect the virtues that are associated with it, according to many faith traditions. Virtues like compassion, connection, empathy, humility, the pursuit of peace. Strangely, these are exactly the same virtues that are needed for authentic dialogue. So by pursuing this, not only do we change inside, but we also change in a way that we can become not just practitioners of dialogue, but people of dialogue at our very core. So for instance, from the monastic world, in meditation, we open our hearts and minds to something larger, what Christians call God. In Christian parlance, we open our hearts to God. God opens God's heart to us, and we begin to reflect the values that are closest to God's heart. Humility, empathy, and all the ones that I mentioned before. That's meditation. In the reading of sacred texts, we encounter something utterly outside ourselves. Now, monks do this in a number of different ways. The practice that I'm referring to specifically here is a slow, contemplative reading of their sacred text, so that they absorb the wisdom from it with the heart as well as with the head. It's not exegesis, it's not textual analysis or anything like that. It is much more of a heart-centered kind of practice. So with our heart, as vulnerable as we are with that, we encounter that something utterly outside ourselves. It was written in a style that we read almost nowhere else on a daily basis, by people who lived in a time and place that are utterly foreign to us, with a set of ethics and behavioral rules that are utterly foreign to us. And as a result, a lot of times, those sacred texts don't make a lot of sense to us in some ways. We can't figure it out at first glance. But as we encounter these texts and draw them into ourselves, they start to dislodge our preset notions. That's the real beauty of reading something strange and foreign like that. Now, I mentioned this at one point at an academic conference, and a humanist scholar, excellent scholar, good friend of mine, objected to my use of the word sacred texts. He said that he could get the same effect by sitting down and reading Wordsworth. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I've never read Wordsworth. So, being a good doobie, I went and bought myself a copy of Wordsworth and sat down and read his poetry, and I thought, my God, he's right. The fact of the matter is, so many of the texts in human history contain deep wisdom. So I think we can use them in this way. I've been on a tear lately through the books of George Eliot, and she occasionally will turn to the reader away from the plot line and drop this breathtaking bit of wisdom. And every time she does it, like every 20 pages, and I have to stop and ponder it, because it's a piece of wisdom I've never quite heard before. And I think if I read that with the heart, it's going to change me. It's going to turn me a little bit. That's the sacred text part, in the practice of community, we encounter frames of reference we never would have come up with ourselves. In an environment where ideally our commitment to one another creates a safe space that gives us the freedom to explore. This happens in monasteries all the time. Monks, each individual monk will take on a variety of projects, anything that he is particularly led to explore, wants to investigate further. There's a lot of freedom because there is commitment. It's a safe space. They know that they're not going anywhere, that they are with each other no matter what. The Christian church is supposed to be like that. It rarely is, unfortunately. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But beyond churches, I think we can see a secular application in civic clubs, groups of friends. My wife and I pursue a hobby that brings us together with a lot of wildly diverse people. I tell people we have PhDs in microbiology, and then we have people who used to work at carnivals. So it's a very, very wide group. Those people, we have become a family over the years, and in my darkest hour, those are probably the people I would turn to before I turn to anybody else, because I know that they're a safe place. And I have learned things from interacting with them. A number of them are Mormons, for instance. So I have learned a lot about the Mormon faith just by interacting, and I saw what a beautiful, loving faith it is. This is one reason that Robert Putnam's bowling alone phenomenon is so fraught with peril, is that it deprives us of that community and therefore that opportunity to get outside ourselves. Before I leave this inner dimension, I want to highlight two of those character strengths, two of those virtues that come out of this practice, because I think they are absolutely essential to dialogue. I would submit they're absolutely essential to life. The first one is humility. Humility gets a bad rap. People think of it in terms of self-deprecation, low self-esteem, mea culpa. I think a better definition of it is a crystal clear view of ourselves and our place in the universe. And when you think about that, or try to achieve that crystal clear view of yourself, one thing that I think all of us can say about ourselves is that each of us is one person among billions, with one set of perspectives and values and opinions among billions. The beauty of that is that when I realize that, I suddenly see how much I don't know. When I see how much I don't know, I see how much when I see how much I don't know, it makes me curious about what you know and what we might learn by talking together. Boom, we're right in a dialogue right there. The other virtue that I want to mention is empathy. When we are oriented toward transcending ourselves, we can see from within the other person. My friend Bill is somebody that I love like a brother. He is a man of great spiritual depth, a good friend for many years. He is also as rigid a fundamentalist as I have ever met. And the go-rounds we have had about the use of the Bible would curl your hair probably. At one point he ran his own, he was in leadership at his church, and he was responsible for giving the sermons. And what he would do is he would send me his sermon for the week for, probably about 6 months or a year. He'd send me his sermon for the week and ask me to critique it. Now, if I had come at it from my normal kind of sort of progressive mindset, I would have ripped it apart. I would have, said, you can't do this, or have you never heard of the historical literal method, or this is clearly not what it meant. And I could have handed it back to him, and it would not have done a bit of good. But because I had spent so much time with Bill, and because of all this spiritual So it emphasizes a holistic, integrated view of humanity. So it's not surprising that anything that comes out of Christian monasticism or that's born of Christian monasticism would go beyond the explicitly spiritual realm to explore other ways in which we can effect this inner transformation, cognitive, social, even physical. So in that spirit, the book describes 3 fundamental mind shifts of mindset that can change the way we think, and I'll cover them briefly. One is, I don't know. There's a Zen teacher that I ran across on the internet who has this thing called meditation on I don't know. And what you're supposed to do is sit down in a meditative position, clear your mind of all thoughts as you do with much of meditation. And then as thoughts come through your head, pay attention to them, and then add I don't know at the end. According to him, if you do this long enough, it will eventually pull the rug out from a lot of your convictions. And you will have to reevaluate things. You get a sense of I don't know. Second one I call and yet. And yet. The Iraq War was an unmitigated disaster. And yet, it did get rid of one of the most brutal dictators of our time. From the conservative side, same-sex marriage will destroy the lives of children. And yet, at least one study has shown that the children of lesbian parents fare better in terms of psychological makeup than children from traditional homes. And yet, the beauty of and yet is that it stops us dead in our tracks. Where all of a sudden it forces us to consider what else might be true. And especially what might be true on whatever side of the debate that we're not on. One thing I love about this is, and this is true of all these cognitive mind shifts, practice is the way to move forward with them. If you do them enough, they start to become instinct. You start looking for the and yet. Some politician will make a grand pronouncement about something, some sort of absolute statement, and you'll say, there's an and yet out there somewhere. And you go looking. And as a result, you understand more. You get more of the nuance. The third one is both and. We are a very, very either-or society. We talked about that with the black and white thinking. And Catholic theologians especially have been very good at articulating this idea of both and. Is it possible when you have X and not X for whatever position, for whatever issue you're talking about, is it possible to bring them together? Is it possible to say, no, it's not either this or this. We can bring them together in both and. If you think about it, Christianity is very good, or Christians are very good at this. Because they've spent the last 2 millennia trying to figure out the doctrine of the Trinity. God is 3 people. God is one essence. What? They've had to put that both and together for many years. So it's natural that it came out of Christianity and also Christian monasticism. So that's the cognitive dimension. The last one I want to mention is the skills dimension. There are a number of practical skills we can use to complement the deeper transformation of our minds and our spirits. Some of these we can do in dialogue, and there are some that we can do before dialogue. I'm going to mention just 2. One because I think it's valuable, the other one because it's fun. Suspend your preconceptions. When I wrote the first draft of the book, I wrote this as abandon your preconceptions. And a couple of my very dear friends took me to the woodshed and said, no, you can't say that. That's ridiculous. And the more I talked with them, the more I realized what the problem was. Fact of the matter is, in many cases, our convictions are things we have spent many years thinking about, pondering, reflecting on. In many cases, we have built our entire lives around them. There is no issue, there are so few dialogues where the fate of the world hangs on the outcome. And it's important to remember this. I was in a house church many years ago where one of the founding principles was an emphasis on community and intimacy. And we decided early on that we were going to split into two churches when we got to a certain size. Well, we got close to that size, and people decided, no, we don't want to do this. This is ridiculous. We want to be with everybody. And people divided into two camps. They went to the extremes. They started shouting at each other. It became very ugly for a long time. People started using euphemisms to discuss it. It's like, well, maybe if we talk about it, maybe if we call it budding or growing or something like that, maybe it'll be better. Maybe that'll help. Well, my friend Bill, the fundamentalist, is also a clown, quite without knowing it. He stood up at one particularly tense meeting, and you could cut the tension with a knife. And he said, I'm sick of this. We've been talking about this issue for 2 years. I can't take it anymore, and I especially can't take the euphemisms. We talk about budding, we talk about growing, and it's all because we're trying to avoid that one 4-letter word, split.
4-letter word.
Split having 5 letters, it basically brought the house down. Did it solve the problem? No, it did not solve the problem. But for one moment, we could look at each other as just human beings again, trying to do the best we could. So it was invaluable. Okay, in closing, let's go back to our original question. How does this individual journey of inner transformation connect with the systemic obstacles of dialogue? My answer to that is very, very slowly. One person at a time, one situation at a time, over years. For me, the connection is best expressed in a couple of quotes that we might dismiss as trite and overused. I have dismissed them as trite and overused. But I think they hold more truth than we might think. The first one is the one attributed often to Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Small approach to very large problems. The other one is from the legendary folk song, "Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me." Is this kind of inner transformation sufficient for creating a whole new world with systems that promote dialogue? No, not at all. Is this kind of inner transformation necessary to start the change? I believe it is. At the very worst, it can empower us to live a life in connection with and in service to others. A fundamental virtue in any belief system. Thank you. Absolutely. Questions?
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Peter?
You ended with the words fundamental faith in any belief system. Our newspapers tell us that 20% of our population consists of non-believers who are not affiliated with any church or any synagogue. And the 80% who are believers, a lot of them go to church, for the coffee hour and the donuts, and are not really believers. Now,